press that. We're just going to wait for just a second. I'm starting up just a little early, about 2 minutes early, just so people can try and hop on. And so I can get started and figure out what I'm doing as per usual. Alright, okay. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Alright. We're figuring it out like we do. Let's hope it stays that way. Oh, and I'm spoiling. I'm spoiling. We have to go back. Okay. So yeah, once again, we're just going to wait a few minutes for people to hop on. I hope you're all having a good morning and that things are going well. Good morning, everyone. Hope you guys have a good weekend, too. We are getting into that, well, colder weather is a stretch because we don't know what's going on. But you should also be having a lot of your kind of winter birds coming in. I know I've heard a lot of juncos have been around recently, or at least people are starting to see their first few, so keep an eye out for any unusual birds you might have in your yard. I know I personally have seen a few yellow-rumped warblers stick around as well too, so you never know who's going to stop by as well. Good morning! Thanks so much for hopping on, I appreciate it. We're just going to give it one more minute to get started, and we have a lot to talk about, so I hope you guys are ready. I hope you're all having a good morning as well. Let's see. Anything else I know? Oh, no, actually, it doesn't worry. It doesn't matter if I know anything else. We are set. It is 8:30, so we're going to go ahead and just jump right into it. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Jolene. I'm a certified songbird feeding specialist with Wild Birds Unlimited of Concord, and we are going to be talking about woodpeckers today, which is very exciting, and we're going to talk about a few different species. So I have a lot, and I might have bitten off more than I can chew, but we're going to see how it goes. So if you guys have any questions, good morning. Please feel free to comment on them. I may read the comments after the presentation just because we have a bit of a doozy today. So I hope you all are ready. And with that, we're going to jump right into it. So you may have noticed of the birds that visit your bird feeders, woodpeckers are probably the most unique in regards to how they move, how they eat, and all that kind of stuff as well. Well, scientifically, that's also stated because these birds are not in the order Passeriformes. They're in the order Pisciformes in the family Piscidae. So they have their own separate order and family that they're in. So that kind of tracks really well. The family Piscidae includes piculets and wrynecks, which we do not have here, but are very interesting to check out, and sapsuckers, which we also have, of course, along with our woodpeckers. This family is found in most places except Australia, New Guinea, and Madagascar. Woodpeckers can be considered habitat specialists. So while some have a more general habitat than others, there are some that have a more sensitive requirement for their habitat. So if anything shifts just by the slightest, they're no longer able to survive in that habitat. So it just depends on the individual species. That does vary. A lot of woodpeckers do remain in woodland habitats because, of course, they do like trees. But as long as some trees are nearby, there are even woodpecker species in savannas, scrublands, and deserts as well, too. Lots of these birds are also non-migratory, so usually they're found in the same general area year-round. Whether or not you see them in your yard year-round is always kind of up for debate. But we also do have some that are partial migrants as well, so they might shuffle a little bit with different altitudes or over a few, at least for our area, over a few states and things like that as well. The yellow-bellied sapsucker is a bird that we have this winter time because they migrate here in the winter. Now, when it comes to identification, the nice thing about these birds is everything from head to toe is an easy ID for woodpeckers. So starting off with their shape and their movements, woodpeckers are primarily an arboreal species, which means you're usually going to find them in the trees as well as along the trunks of trees. Not many birds are going to be shifting and moving directly on the trunks. When they do, woodpeckers are the only ones that really kind of keep that upright posture in the sense that their head will always be facing upwards even as they scale down a tree. Nuthatches, for example, don't follow this logic and just go up and down every which way with no problem. So even their movements are specific between other trunk crawling birds, essentially. For their shape, woodpeckers do have that pointed, chiseled bill, which is great for hammering into wood, hence the name woodpecker. Their wings, when in flight, are a little bit more rounded rather than pointed, and you can also identify a woodpecker by its flight pattern. This one can be a little bit more tricky, but basically, as a woodpecker flies, when they start to dip, they'll flap once, which pushes them up. They'll pause, they'll go back down, they'll flap once. So it's kind of like an undulating flight pattern with woodpeckers as well. So if you ever see one in flight, you can kind of pay attention to that behavior too. When they are moving around and clinging to like the side of a tree, you'll notice that their tails are pointed a little bit. So they kind of have this W shape going on. So there's a heavy notch right in the middle that usually separates their largest two tail feathers. And that's also kind of a good example of those woodpeckers as well. It doesn't quite look that way in flight, but you still have that large notch in the center too. Now, while woodpecker species do look very different from each other, a lot of them are black and white, but we have lots of different colorations. Oftentimes, you can still tell the difference between your males and your females, but it can sometimes be subtle. So, for example, these are downy woodpeckers, both the male and the female. They're probably the most common woodpecker that we have in this area and are the easiest to find because you can often find them at parks, suburban areas. They don't need they're a little bit more generalist in comparison to a lot of other habitat specialists, right? So with the woodpecker males, they often have red in a specific spot on their person. So for the male woodpecker, they have a little bit spot of red on the back of their head, while the downy female does not. So usually you're going to have a distinct marking difference between the male and the female. You can also, of course, identify these birds by their calls and their drumming sounds. So the calls are usually high-pitched single notes. Each species basically has a different pitch, but they can often happen in rapid succession. It sounds something like this. So it's that very rapid one-pitch call, essentially, that they do. Each woodpecker kind of has a similar style to that way, but that one is, for example, the downies. And then they also do these drumming sounds, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it looks really cool as well. So I'm going to turn this one up just a little bit. I apologize if that's a problem. But it looks like this. This is, again, the downy woodpecker here. Once more. So essentially, the drumming sound is also unique amongst the woodpeckers. So a red-bellied's drumming will sound different from a downy's drumming. So you can actually identify the birds by those noises as well. You just have to have a good ear for it and kind of commit those things to memories. Now, like I said, or at least like I said with like the discussion of this presentation, we have 8 species of woodpeckers here in North Carolina, and there are many more in the U.S. and North America in general. The ones that usually a lot of people see in their yards are going to be the downy woodpecker that we have here, as well as the red-belly in the center. One thing that they often confuse with the red belly is that they assume the red belly is the red-headed due to the fact that it has the red mohawk on it. When compared to the actual red-headed woodpecker, you can see who has a little bit more of that red head and takes that title. What many people don't notice with the red belly is that they do in fact have a red belly there as well too. So that's kind of where that focus is as well. You'll note that with all of these birds, they do have that similar upright posture. They have that longer chiseled bill, as well as, what is it? Yeah, they have that pointed tail as well too. So all of those factors can kind of help with bird ID. One other thing I will mention, somebody's calling the store too early. One other thing that I will mention is that the downy and the hairy woodpecker can often be very confusing to identify. Reason for that is because the hairy woodpecker looks, again, very similar. The hairy woodpecker is about double the size of the downy woodpecker, and unless they're side by side, it can be a little bit tricky to identify them both. So some good rules of thumb to try and identify your hairies versus your downies is, remember, the hairies are larger. One good way to identify them that is sometimes a little hard to explain is to look at the beak length and compare it between these two birds. So for example, a lot of people will say if you take the beak length and flip that length along the back of the bird's head. So just basically flip it. If the beak is much longer and goes past where the eye is located, it's probably your hairy woodpecker. If it's a shorter beak when you flip it and it kind of ends to just past the eye, it's probably going to be your downy woodpecker. And another really cool distinction that I always forget about sometimes is that if you look at their tail feathers, these two birds have outer white tail feathers. The downies have a spotted outer white tail feather that you could see in flight here as well too, while the hairy woodpeckers do not have those spots on their outer white tail feathers. So that is another distinction between those two species. So just different kinds of things to think about there. The red-cockaded woodpecker is found more towards the eastern side of this. Eastern side of the state in longleaf pine forests. The yellow-bellied sapsuckers are here in the wintertime. Northern flickers can be found here as well too, but they prefer certain habitats that may not be available in your yard. And the same can be said with the red-headed woodpecker and, of course, the pileated, who is our largest species of woodpecker here, measuring at about 19 inches tall. So they are very large, and I think you will always be surprised your first time seeing a pileated. They prefer larger, old, mature forests, they definitely have more specific habitat requirements there as well, too. And again, all of these birds have that sexual dimorphism or the difference between their males and females. So examples of this, the female pileated woodpecker has that black mustache, but the males have a red mustache. The red-bellied woodpecker females have a little kind of bald spot of tan where it interrupts the red. And actually, I said that they all do have that sexual dimorphism, but the red-headed woodpecker, you actually can't tell the difference between your males and your females. So there's an exception to every rule that I mentioned, but usually there are subtle differences between your males and females, with the woodpecker species anyways. So, of course, with these guys, interesting lifestyle, they have to have a lot of adaptations to keep up with their strategies, because as their woodpecker name states, they peck a lot of wood, and that can get pretty crazy sometimes. So from head to toe, they have a lot of different adaptations. First off, with their skull, in order to kind of help as they hammer into wood, the bone up here has some sections that are spongier and air-filled, so they don't necessarily work as shock absorbers, but they help provide a little bit more cushion there. They have, just because of the scale of these birds, they have a very small brain that's tightly packed into the skull, so there's less chances of it getting rattled around or potentially getting damaged. And with the way that they move and at the short bursts that they do it, it redistributes the force of impact, so it's not as dangerous to them as we might think, and how it looks for sure. Their bills, of course, we talked about how they're kind of stout and pretty pointed in order to help them easily hammer into wood. But another fun thing is that the bristles along the front of their beak are actually, they're a type of feather that covers the nostrils that are there as well too, so that as they're looking through all this debris, that's going to keep any of that debris from getting in there as well. And by far my favorite adaptation is their tongue. If you did not know, the woodpecker has a tongue that is 2 to 3 times longer than its bill. Hopefully you can see it well in this picture here of that little tongue that's poking right out there. The reason for this is that it's connected to something called the hyoid apparatus, which is a mix of bone and cartilage that essentially wraps around the back of the skull all the way up to the tongue in the front, so that when a woodpecker pushes out its tongue, it causes this whole mechanism to shift. It's really interesting. They also have a tongue barb at the end of their tongue that helps catch any insects as they're looking for food as well. One video that I will highly recommend if you don't have a problem checking out like skulls and seeing tongues like that as well, Whitmer Lab, in association with Ohio University, has a really cool video of a specimen that they were preparing for exhibit. So it shows the woodpecker skull as well as the hyoid apparatus itself, and it shows how that all moves. So if you're curious to see that and aren't squeamish about bones or things like that as well, Random Acts of Anatomy, the woodpecker hyolingual tongue apparatus is a really cool video to check out, and I highly recommend it. Other adaptations include their feet. So again, these birds are not a part of the order Passeriformes, which means perching songbirds. So a lot of the birds in this order for Passeriformes have 3 toes in the front and 1 toe in the back. With these woodpeckers, they actually have a different foot pattern. They have 2 toes in the front and 2 toes in the back, and it's a zygodactyl foot pattern. Essentially, this pattern allows for more maneuverability along the trunk of the tree, and it makes it more comfortable for them to kind of work the way their lifestyle does. Of course, there are also exceptions to this as well. So there is a 3-toed woodpecker that we have here in the States, not in this state, but further out west, I believe, that only has 2 toes in the front and 1 in the back. And that seems to work really well for them, so each specific case is always different. Lastly, as they're making all these movements and hammering into these trees, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit more support, and that is where the tail comes in. So essentially, woodpecker tails are very pointed, and the center of their feathers have a very rigid spine. And these stiff, like quills or spines of their feathers help, oh no, go back, there we go, help prop up the woodpecker and support it as it's doing its as it's hammering into trees and everything like that as well. These are the last feathers to molt because they are so important to the woodpecker's lifestyle, and when they do start to molt, they start with the outer 2 feathers and so slowly work their way in, so they still have support along the way as well. Now, we've kind of talked about this because we know there's a few reasons that woodpeckers do their thing. A primary portion of their diet is insects. They're very good at tapping the trees and listening for hollow wood, as well as insect noise. So their hearing is very good. And there are high chances that these birds smell formic acid, which is an odor that's emitted by ants and other insects. So they listen for those things before they pry into wood to access that food. But not only are insects a part of their diet, each woodpecker species also has different types of preferences. So you'll find many that go for different nuts and seeds and fruits. A few examples of these different preferences include acorn woodpeckers, which are found out west. They're very good at having entire granaries, which are known as trees that have just been pocked full of holes that basically they stuff as many acorns as possible into, so that as the weather gets cooler or things start to change, they still have food resources they can access later in the year. Sapsuckers, also like their name describes, are a huge fan of sap, so they will peck at trees to release the sap and eat from there. And then, of course, as exceptions to any rule, when I stated most woodpeckers are arboreal, northern flickers are one of the few that are ground foragers. So if you notice the woodpecker's bill in comparison to others, it's slightly curved. And that's because they do a lot of like flicking behaviors to move material and debris out of the way to look for insects as well. So each individual woodpecker also has different strategies and different food preferences as well. Now, in the later winter and early spring, when it comes to preparing for nesting season, these birds do have some interesting courtship strategies. Oftentimes, these birds are monogamous and they are very territorial, so the males will usually set up an area and try to attract a mate through drumming, which is that seasonal activity we talked about, that basically it's very loud and it attracts mates and declares territory as well too. There are some species that have slightly different strategies as well when it comes to like nesting in general. So the red-cockaded woodpecker actually has helpers when they're nesting as well. So you have a breeding pair of male and female red-cockaded, and then you have others that are non-breeding but will help the breeding pair raise their young as well too. So again, different strategies depending on the species. But yeah, we kind of talked about that drumming behavior that occurs. And then one of my favorite things is that there is a type of dance that these birds do in competition with other males or females. So whether this is specifically vying for a mate or whether it's investigating a good territory, it looks something like this, which is always a chuckle to me. So these birds compete in the most non-confrontational way I've ever seen, but essentially they kind of bob their head back and forth and show off everything about them, which is really interesting. And this is how they dispute basically territory or competing for certain mates as well. So that was 2 male pileated woodpeckers, and then I've also got video of 2 northern flicker females vying for to be the winner as well too, of whatever discrepancy they have. So they're very interesting. A little funny, but hey, it means a lot to them, and that's how they work it with the bird world for them. So I think that's really interesting. So, and I think they compete a little bit more in just a second. Yep. So if you ever see this happening, you know they've definitely got some serious discussion going on. Nothing's broken, that's just how they function, which I think is really cool. All right. So when they establish their pairs as well for nesting, the male and the female do work together throughout the entire thing. So these pairs often work together to make the cavity for nesting. They are the OG cavity nesters, or the first ones to do it, because they are the ones that excavate their own cavities. This can often take 10 to 28 days to complete, and they can often make 1 to 2 cavities a year. They'll utilize these cavities for both nesting and roosting behaviors as well. And sometimes, if you're out in the park and ever notice wood chips falling on you, it can be because these birds are trying to clean house as well too. So again, they will use it for both nesting and roosting as well, which is cool. So this is a male red-bellied basically cleaning out the cavity nest that they are working on too. So very fun behavior, interesting to see, and I'm so glad people are able to pay attention and record these things and post it to Macway Library as well. So it is a fun time. Now, something that is really cool about woodpeckers as well is they rarely reuse the same cavity. So they will often go to a different tree every year and make a new cavity for nesting. This, in some areas, does establish them as a keystone species. These keystone species are important to an environment because the second you take them out of an environment, it causes an entire domino effect of adjustment and changes and reduction of different wildlife that are in the area as well too. So the reason for this is because there are a lot of secondary cavity nesters. So those that will still nest in a cavity but don't build them themselves. So bluebirds, titmice, wrens, most of the nuthatches, chickadees. Chickadees will sometimes excavate their own, but you get the idea. These birds will use an open cavity if it is available. So with the woodpeckers creating so many nesting spots, it provides more diversity, less competition in regards to the best two different nesting sites, and just allows for more variety to sustain themselves in that habitat. So it's really cool as well too. And also these birds do use living or dead trees. So each species may have a specific preference. Red cockaded woodpeckers will use live trees, and that sap basically creates difficulty for any potential predators that might check things out. Pileated woodpeckers prefer larger dead trees as well too, so they need something big because they are big birds in general. So each one has a different strategy, but as long as the tree is large enough to not tap sap, we are good to go. Or at least not tap sap into the nest anyways. So once the cavity is set up, they can have anywhere from 1 to 2 broods per season with 4 to 6 eggs. A lot of these eggs are usually white because they're already hidden by a cavity. There's no need to have extra camouflage like a killdeer nest does. Incubation takes about 2 weeks, and when these birds hatch, they are altricial young, meaning they are blind, naked, defenseless, and require a lot of parental care. But even right from the get-go, you can see that these guys also have some adaptations for living in a cavity nest like this one. On the back of their ankles, which is actually right over here, so it's a little bit past the feet, so it's over here, is a hardened callus or pad that allows these birds to easily kind of move around in the nest as they're younger, because again, it's basically just hardwood floor essentially that they're staying on there. And up by their bill is a very large sensitive lump on the lower mandible, so that when the adults are trying to feed their young, they can basically tap these in order to get the birds to open up their mouths. Let me see, so we got this one here. So just an example of what it can look like when the birds are feeding is over here. Let's see. So this is a pileated woodpecker and a almost fledgling here. So they could be very loud, but essentially when they feed their young, it kind of looks like a jackhammer. It looks a little bit stressful, but that is basically how they do, which is always really fun as well to witness. So it looks a little aggressive, but that gets the job done too. All right, let me see. Now, when these birds When they eventually fledge, the young still do require a lot of parental care. So depending on the species, once again, because it varies, this can be anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks or several months. And usually the parents will split up and take a few of their young and take care of them separately just to kind of help split the care. They'll continue feeding them and introducing them to different foraging sites. So if you've ever seen a woodpecker grab some food at the feeders and bring it back to a younger one, or some of your other birds like bluebirds do this as well, it's always an interesting sight to witness. Keep an eye out for that during the nesting season. Also, juveniles can look different from the adults. Usually this happens with both the red-headed and the red-bellied woodpeckers the most. So for a lot of us, the red-bellied, that can happen quite a lot. The red-bellied has no red on its head when it first fledges from the nest, and the red-headed woodpecker does not have any red either. It's more of those darker brown feathers as well too. So just kind of keep that in mind when we're ever during nesting season, that those differences can occur as well. Now, one thing I want to mention, because we're almost there, so sorry if this goes a little over, is that there have been cases of extinction, conservation, and ways to kind of help woodpeckers as well too, because we did mention a little bit that most of these birds are habitat specialists, and they do have preferences that are very crucial to their survival. One example of a more depressing case is the ivory-billed woodpecker, who would have been even larger than the pileated that we have today. They lived in mature pine forests found in the south and southeast that were by bald cypress swamps, and as those areas were logged and those swamps decreased, these populations started to go down. This was also before any types of laws were in place to preserve populations, so many museums and private collectors were also on the move to grab a specimen for themselves, which also drastically decreased the population. So there was a very long period of time where these birds were not sighted for years. The only photos and video that we have of them are in black and white, and you can see them on allaboutbirds.org. But it was back in 2004 that these birds were potentially rediscovered in a region of Arkansas. There's no credible photos or video or sound other than what the people say they saw. So recently there was a decision. They were on the list to potentially finally declare them extinct, but that decision was still delayed. There is still hope that these birds are out there, which there is technically a chance because there are many species that have gone unseen for years before finally popping up, but who's to say about these birds specifically? On the other hand, we do have more kind of successful stories or on the rise that we were able to catch in time. For example, the red-cockaded woodpecker, who I mentioned does stay in those longleaf pine forests in more of the eastern section of our state, but in the southeast of the U.S. in general, prefers longleaf pine forests that are shaped by lightning fire, so they often have very little understory growth. That is the kind of forest habitat that they prefer. Their population first started decline with logging and turpentine production as well too. When these forests were originally logged, they were then replaced with faster growing loblolly pines, which is great because you're trying to get the trees to grow faster, which again would provide that habitat. But these trees are not well adapted to fire, causing issues where if any fires occurred, these trees would go with it. So in an attempt to suppress the burnings, that increased that understory growth, and that understory growth is not a preference to red-cockaded woodpeckers. So once again, that habitat was not suitable for them. So in the efforts to sustain their populations, there were agreed on plans to preserve and expand their habitat. So things like the Safe Harbor Agreement, which helped private landowners feel comfortable in their land, not thinking anybody else was going to take it over, while while people were able to investigate the red-cockaded woodpecker nests as well, there were ways to kind of keep both sides of the effort safe. Controlled burnings to help reduce that understory growth to make it more suitable for these birds, and also maintaining nest cavities, both artificial and natural, and having often many observations and check-ins on these specific nests. You will note that many red-cockaded woodpeckers are heavily banded in order to monitor research, what nesting cavity they came from, who's doing well, who's not, all that kind of stuff. And recently this year, they were downlisted from endangered to threatened, which means that their population is starting to go up. Does that mean that this case is closed and shut? It doesn't, but it is a sign of hope that things are starting to improve, and we're learning a lot about these woodpeckers as well too, which has been a lot of fun. So still got a ways to go, but it is a sign of hope in many ways. Now, when it comes to attracting or potentially repelling woodpeckers, because I know people have issues with both, we've talked about a lot of things with these birds. We know that they are vertical feeders and they perch vertically as well. So areas that have an easy perch or platform for them to kind of land on, or easy clinging feeders that they can again stay vertically, are going to be really good options. Suet is usually a very popular option for them. Suet is just rendered fat, which is just boiled for removal of bacteria and other impurities, and is usually mixed with other ingredients such as mealworms, peanuts, tree nuts, or fruit as well. It comes in many styles, such as cakes, cylinders, and other types of things. Many people are used to like the cakes that go in like the suet cage feeders as well too, and suet can be fed throughout the year because there are different styles. There are those that have a higher melting point for the summertime and those that have a lower melting point for the wintertime. So you can feed suet year round. A lot of people just do better with it in the winter because fat is great for keeping up a bird's energy so that they can sustain themselves through colder weather. One other thing that I will mention with these types of feeders as well is that for Wild Birds Unlimited, we do have a feeder with a tail prop. This tail prop essentially provides that support so that the woodpeckers can, again, use their tail to prop themselves up as they're eating at these feeders. Another option to offer these birds as well are spreadable suets. Wild Birds Unlimited has one known as bark butter that is available for hold on. So bark butter is a spreadable suet. It was made by the founder of Wild Birds Unlimited, Jim Carpenter, and essentially it can be spread onto the trunk of a tree like so, and keeping those little notches in it makes it easier for birds to pick up and eat themselves. But that's also a really good option if you don't necessarily want to use a feeder, but want to see them kind of check out the trees as well. Bark butter actually can attract a variety of birds, not just woodpeckers, but wrens, nuthatches. I've even seen blue jays and cardinals go for it as well too. So there's a lot of variety there as well. If suet is not your vibe, which totally happens, there's different options like peanuts, tree nuts, and mealworms as well. And even they will go for sunflower and dried fruit too. You could do dry or fresh fruit and kind of see what happens as long as it's not any added sugars or anything like that, just organic fruit, essentially. And if you can't really feed in your area, keeping up dead trees or snags that are in safe locations. So obviously we don't want anything falling on anybody's houses or in places where you'll need to make major repairs afterwards. But if you have trees in safe locations that are dead, leave them up or cut them in half and kind of leave a good portion up, because that's going to either be great nesting areas or great foraging areas as well too for these birds. So even dead plants and detritus and trees provide great options for our wildlife as well. Now, for those of you that do have woodpecker problems, let's talk about that just a little bit. First off, woodpecker drumming. It usually announces territory, happens in the late winter, early spring. It's a seasonal behavior and can often occur on the gutters of somebody's house, which means you're waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning crying because there's a woodpecker that won't stop knocking. This one is a tough one to avoid. It is temporary, but not always fun, and it does not usually cause damage to the house in any form. In other cases, you can have damage, whether that's through foraging or excavation. It's important to check out the location that the woodpeckers are pecking at. Is there an insect infestation, or are they trying to excavate a certain cavity as well? Usually in these areas, you can offer like doing reflective streamers that are shiny with constant movement. These are not effective all the time because they can get used to them, but it does reduce potential damage in that area. There's also burlap or bird netting that you can use where like where the hole is, make sure you have it at least 3 inches from the siding, wherever 3 inches is here, and make sure that it remains taut to prevent tangling, because the last thing we want to do is get anybody stuck in there as well. So if you have something like that up, you want to make sure you have eyes on it, at all times and are constantly monitoring to make sure nobody gets stuck, because it is not a fun time to deal with that. I will never, ever, ever recommend any type of sticky repellent. Be mindful of duct tape or other things, because birds can get caught. People will use like sticky traps in garage. Small rodents, lizards, reptiles, everything will get caught in there. So I do not recommend those things. And if the damage is small enough and you've confirmed that there is no insect infestation there, definitely feel free to use wood fill to prevent further damage. Some people often confuse carpenter bee holes with woodpecker damage as well, so make sure you're kind of keeping a lookout for that as well. And the last thing I will mention too is many people get stressed out because yellow-bellied sapsuckers often will go for their trees and make pocked markings on the tree that look like this. Yellow-bellied sapsuckers prefer to go for trees that are older, that are ill or dying, or possibly have a fungal infection. So usually if your tree's pretty healthy, they aren't super interested, so there could be something else going on, but it doesn't necessarily cause damage that isn't already there in certain ways, if that makes sense. So there could be underlying problems if you have a yellow-bellied sapsucker checking out your trees. All right, and I think with that, because we are a little over and I apologize, that is all I have to say about woodpeckers today. So if you are coming into the store or want to make a phone order or anything like that, I have a coupon code Woodpecker to save you $5 off a $25 purchase or more. So that just saves you $5 there if you need to purchase anything today. And of course, we do have a second viewing of this presentation in store at 11 in case you know anybody in the area that might be interested. Once again, a lot of the resources and images and video came from Macaulay Library at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. There's great resources there, and you can check out all of these species on allaboutbirds.org as well too if you want to learn more about specific ones or get an ear out for those calls and drumming sounds as well too. And with that said, I'm done. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I really appreciate it. I hope you guys had a lot of fun. If you have any questions, I will be sure to kind of check out the comments as well too. So I very much appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you all next time. So thank you and have a good day.